Well, hello, fellow pilots. I'm John Kang.
And I'm Martha King.
Welcome to the Complete Airspace Review. Now, this course will make the International Alphabet Airspace System simple. In fact, we'll show you on screen how the Alphabet Airspace System is designed and what each class of airspace means to you as a pilot.
And we're going to make it easy to remember all of this too, because you'll learn a word for each airspace letter that will make remembering what you need to know about that class of airspace easy and fun.
In addition to Alphabet Airspace, we'll also cover other kinds of airspace that you need to know about as a pilot. We'll be covering special use airspace, controlled firing areas, military training routes, air defense identification zones, temporary flight restrictions, special conservation areas, and more.
And finally, we have a special segment that will show you how, as a VFR pilot, you can manage your flight so that you can deal with the airspace system safely and legally and make the system work for you instead of against you. But enough of this. Let's get started. And to do that, let's join John as he makes the alphabet system of airspace as easy as ABC.
Now, this international airspace system is designed to make you and me worldly. In fact, you and I are about to become international aviation citizens of the world. And the reason is, this system is designed to standardize terminology so that no matter where in the world that you and I might fly, we'll both know and understand the airspace system. Now, some people tend to look at this and think, my goodness, this is complicated stuff. Well, the fact is, it's not that complicated. In fact, you and I will just now take 30 seconds out and memorize the whole thing. Let's do it. It's that simple. Let's take a look, for instance, at Class A airspace. Well, when you see Class A airspace, think altitude, because that's the airspace at 18,000 feet and above. Now, when you see Class A airspace, you know that you have to be instrument rated and instrument equipped and on an IFR flight plan at an altitude assigned by ATC, because they keep track of all of the airplanes flying at 18,000 feet and above. So when you see Class A airspace, just think altitude. Now, when you see Class B airspace, think big, because this is the airspace that has big airplanes and big airports. You can even think Boeing. So when you see Class B airspace, simply think big, and you've got it memorized. Now, when you see Class C airspace, think crowded or congested. And because Class C airspace is so busy that they give you radar help sequencing you to the airport, and you have to talk to them. So think crowded or congested when you see Class C airspace. Now, Class D airspace is easy, folks. Think dialogue, because that's where airports have control towers, and where airports have control towers, you know you must talk to them before you enter the area. So think dialogue when you see Class D. Class E airspace is everywhere else that is controlled airspace. So think elsewhere. It's the airways and space between the airways that isn't some other class of airspace. So when you see Class E, think elsewhere. It's all the other controlled airspace. Now, here is the one I enjoy the most, because when you see Class G airspace, think go for it. Because Class G airspace is uncontrolled airspace, and you can fly in Class G airspace without talking to anybody. Now, I can even make this less complicated and more simple. Here's how. There are really only two classes of airspace. There is uncontrolled airspace, that's Class G airspace, and there is controlled airspace, which is all the rest. What's the difference? Well, in uncontrolled airspace, they do not provide any separation service for IFR flights. Now, if you're an IFR pilot, you can still fly in a cloud in uncontrolled airspace. But when you do that, you're really playing Russian roulette, because they have no idea who else might be in that same cloud with you, because they don't keep track of IFR airplanes in uncontrolled airspace. So normally, you only see the very bravest IFR pilots flying IFR in uncontrolled airspace. Now, what this means to you as a VFR pilot is that in uncontrolled airspace, you can fly much closer to a cloud and probably still be safe and certainly be legal because you wouldn't normally expect to see somebody come busting out of the cloud and hit you. So in uncontrolled airspace, the required distance from clouds for VFR aircraft is less and the weather minimums are less. So in Class G airspace, you know it's uncontrolled airspace and you don't have very strict weather minimums for VFR flight. In all the rest of this airspace, they do provide separation service for IFR flights. So it is all controlled airspace. And for a VFR pilot, you know that the weather minimums are greater in controlled airspace. In fact, in general, if you look at uncontrolled airspace at the bottom and then go up towards the front of the alphabet, you'll find that the airspace becomes more and more complicated and busy, and they provide more and more air traffic control service as you get to the front of the alphabet. And of course, when you get to Class A airspace, they keep track of every single airplane up there. Now, let's you and I take a real good look at Class G airspace. Actually, all airspace is Class G airspace unless it's designated otherwise, and Class G is shown on a chart by the absence of any other class of airspace. For instance, in this particular case, we have airspace with a floor of 1,200 feet. That's shown by the fuzzy side of the blue. The FAA likes to call that blue vignette, by the way. So here on the fuzzy side of the blue, we have airspace floor of 1,200 feet. On the distinct side of the blue, that is not controlled airspace, so therefore it's Class G or uncontrolled airspace. When you have floor of controlled airspace 700 feet, it's shown by the fuzzy side of the magenta up here like so. Now, any Class G airspace goes from the surface up to any overlying airspace. So in this particular case, the Class G airspace goes from the surface up to 14,500 feet MSL. That's because all the airspace in the 48 contiguous states in Alaska is controlled airspace 14,500 feet MSL and above. Now, when you're in the fuzzy side of the blue here, you have Class G airspace underneath the floor of controlled airspace, which is 1,200 feet. So Class G goes from the surface to 1,200 feet. And inside the fuzzy side of magenta, Class G airspace goes from the surface to 700 feet. Now, this blue vignette that we talked about, you will not see that in the eastern part of the United States because almost all the airspace, in fact, I'd go so far as to say that all the airspace in the eastern part of the United States is floor of controlled airspace 1,200 feet. So therefore, they will not show this distinction on the chart. They don't even show the fuzzy side of the blue because they don't need to, because they don't have the distinct side of the blue, because there is no uncontrolled airspace or Class G in the eastern part of the U.S. until you get below 1,200 feet or 700 feet. So you won't see this in the eastern part of the U.S., and you won't even see the fuzzy side of the blue. Now, what is the significance to you as a VFR pilot and me as a VFR pilot in Class G airspace? Well, once again, you can go for it in Class G airspace because it's uncontrolled. You don't have to talk to anybody to fly in Class G airspace. Now, if you do talk to air traffic control, they still might be able to give you safety alerts and traffic advisories when radar and communications equipment are available and when the workload permits. And if they give you a safety alert, they're going to warn you if you're dangerously close to another aircraft or terrain or obstructions. And traffic advisories, and I might say traffic at 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock, but that's only on a workload permitting basis and only if they have radar and communications coverage available. Let's take a look at the lowest level of controlled airspace. That's Class E. The way to remember that is elsewhere. It's all the other controlled airspace. Now, Class E with a floor of 1,200 feet is shown with the fuzzy side of the blue. But sometimes Class E has a floor of other than 1,200 feet. In that case, they will write the floor of the Class E airspace right here in the fuzzy side of the blue, and you can see it's 5,500 feet MSL. Then you notice there's this tire tread-like symbol. Well, when you get on the other side of that tire tread-like symbol, that tells you that the floor of controlled airspace is back down to the 1,200 feet because there's no number written in that floor there. Now, here is fuzzy side of magenta. That means floor of controlled airspace 700 feet. Now, the purpose of that Class E down to 700 feet is to allow an IFR airplane to climb and descend and still be in the safety of controlled airspace, to still have separation service from ATC. Now, eventually, this IFR airplane is going to want to go in and land on the ground. So this magenta dashed line says that Class E is extended all the way down to the ground, and that's called surface area Class E, and it's shown by what they call that segmented line. I call it a magenta dashed line, and that means Class E airspace goes all the way down to the ground. Now, let's you and I take a look at the structure of Class E airspace. First of all, we said earlier, if there's any Class G or uncontrolled airspace, it goes from the surface up to 14,500 feet MSL, because the floor of the Class E airspace everywhere in the 48 contiguous states in Alaska is 14,500 feet MSL. Now, sometimes you'll see the fuzzy side of the blue, and in general, that means floor of controlled airspace 1,200 feet AGL. In the U.S., on the eastern part of the U.S., you won't even see fuzzy side of blue. You just can take it as a given. It's floor of controlled airspace 1,200 feet AGL. Now, if you do see fuzzy side of blue with another number, that tells you the floor of controlled airspace is other than 1,200 feet AGL. Now, when you see fuzzy side of magenta, that means floor of Class E at 700 feet. And when you see the magenta dashed lines, that means the Class E airspace goes all the way down to the ground, and that's called surface area Class E. And it goes all the way down to the ground, or it goes from the ground and extends upward to whatever it is the base of the overlying airspace. Now, that surface area Class E provides protection service, separation service for IFR flights all the way down to the ground, but they can only do that when ATC communications and weather are available. For instance, if weather reporting is unavailable, then Class E moves up to a floor of 700 feet and it does not go all the way down to the ground again. Now, for VFR aircraft, there are no communications or equipment requirements for a VFR flight in Class E. You can fly in here all the time. You do have increased weather minimums, so you need to watch out for the weather minimums, but as far as communications and equipment requirements for VFR flights, there are none. For IFR aircraft in Class E, now you will have separation service because that's what it's all about, and you have to have a comm radio to do that and a clearance to fly in Class E. Now, can you get any service as a VFR aircraft in Class E? Well, on a workload permitting basis, when they have the time to do this, they might give you safety alerts and advisories, but Class E does not require you to have communications to fly VFR. Now, let's you and I take a look at Class E airspace as it might appear to a pilot in the air. First of all, some Class E has a floor of other than 1,200 feet. You can see that by fuzzy side of blue with a number in it. Then most Class E airspace has a floor of 1,200 feet. That's the fuzzy side of the blue. Of course, when you get near the airport, you have Class E airspace with a floor of 700 feet, and that's the fuzzy side of the magenta. And of course, at the airport itself, Class E airspace will very often go all the way down to the ground, and that's shown with the magenta dashed lines. So as you take a look at this from the end, you get the whole picture. You have floor of controlled airspace 1,200 feet, and that's fuzzy side of blue. Floor of controlled airspace 700 feet, fuzzy side of magenta, and the airspace Class E going all the way down to the ground with the magenta dashed lines. Now let's take a look at Class D airspace. When you see Class D, think dialogue, because when there is Class D airspace, that means there's a control tower on field, and you must establish two-way communications with the control tower. So when you see Class D, think dialogue. Now let's you and I take a look at how Class D airspace is shown on a sectional chart or any aeronautical chart, and it's shown with a blue segmented line like so. That tells you that they have Class D airspace there, and you must have a dialogue. Class D airspace tells you also they have a control tower on field. In that particular case, the airport symbol is shown in blue as well. Now, another thing that Class D airspace does is it extends control airspace all the way down to the ground at control tower at airports. And so you know as an IFR airplane, you're going to be in the safety of controlled airspace all the way down to the ground. They're going to provide separation service all the way down to the surface. Now, to enter this Class D airspace, communications is required. And if you're entering for the purpose of taking off or landing at this airport, you must have a clearance to take off or land in this airport. Now, when is the Class D in effect? Anytime the associated control tower is in operation. If the control tower operator quits for the evening, turns out the lights, and shuts the door, the Class D airspace goes away because the control tower is no longer in operation. Now, I like to tell people the purpose of Class D airspace is to keep two airplanes from running into each other on the ground. I said that one time. Somebody says, "Hey, John, what are you talking about? You're confused." Well, I am often confused. So I said, what's not correct? He says, "Oh, no, the purpose of Class D airspace is noise abatement." I said, "Noise abatement? What are you talking about?" He says, "Well, if two airplanes do run into each other on the runway, it makes a tremendous amount of noise." Well, I guess that is true, that there is an element of noise abatement involved here, but the real purpose is to keep two airplanes separated from each other on the runway. Now, Class D airspace also provides what they call a safe, orderly, and expeditious flow of traffic on and in the vicinity of an airport, but the tower does not provide separation service for VFR aircraft in the air. For instance, you call a tower controller and he'll say report left downwind. Well, there's a tendency to think that the tower is providing separation service from that time on, and that is not correct. The only separation service a tower provides is to keep airplanes separated from each other on the runway. And if you're not on the runway, you're not going to get separation service. You are still responsible for looking out the window and make sure you don't run into other aircraft. What the tower does provide is advisories. If they know of traffic, they will tell you about it. They'll give you traffic alerts when they think you're dangerously close to another aircraft or terrain or obstructions. They will also sequence aircraft to the runway to get you all lined up in order. And they will provide separation service on the runway, but not in the air. Now, there is all sorts of different sizes and shapes to Class D airspace, but the standard shape is that they have a circle going around the airport called the core area. And that core area is 4.4 nautical miles. That works out, by the way, to 5 statute miles, and that's called the core area. Now, there will be some extensions from time to time, and they're added as necessary to keep IFR approaches within controlled airspace. And the Class D airspace starts at the surface and goes up to 2,500 feet above the airport elevation as a rule. It's not always 2,500 feet. To find out exactly what the top of Class D airspace is, you look at the number inside this square here, and the top of the airspace here, or Class D airspace, is 2,800 feet MSL. By the way, they'll round it off. If you see a minus sign here, if there is a minus sign, the minus sign, as in this case, tells you that the Class D airspace goes up to, but not including, the elevation shown here. So this airspace top is Class D, tops out up to, but not including, 1,500 feet. Generally, the reason for that is there will be some kind of overlying airspace that has a floor of, say, 1,500 feet, as in this particular case. So this minus sign tells you up to, but not including, the elevation shown right here in the box. Now, we said earlier the standard shape of Class D airspace is to have a core area with some extensions. Now, if those extensions are going to extend beyond 2 nautical miles from the core area, they will make them as Class E airspace, and they will show them as magenta dash lines rather than blue dash lines. To a VFR pilot flying along, what that means is you do not have to establish two-way communications to fly in Class E airspace. You do to fly in Class D airspace, but this is Class E airspace out here, and you do not have to establish two-way communications. Now, of course, what you do have to have in Class E airspace is the proper weather to fly in there. You must comply with the weather minimums for Class E airspace. Now, how do you know when you have to give the control tower a call? And the answer is, anytime you're going to fly across this blue dash line, you have to give the guy in the tower a call. So if you're VFR and you have any doubt in your mind, well, you have to give the tower a call if you fly inside that blue dash line below the MSL altitude shown here as the ceiling of the Class D airspace. Now, what are the requirements to fly inside Class D airspace? Of course, you have to have communications radios so you can establish two-way communications. And, of course, if you want to transition through the area, you still have to give them a call. It doesn't matter if you're not landing at the primary airport, you still have to give them a call. Now, let's assume you have Class D airspace with a secondary airport inside the Class D airspace. Here's the primary up here. Now, let's assume that you want to land at the secondary airport. The rule now says that you must call first before entering that Class D airspace, even if you're landing at a secondary instead of the primary. Aha, you say, how about taking off from the secondary airport and you can't reach them on the ground? Then when you're taking off from that secondary airport, you should call as soon as is practicable. Call as soon as you can. Now, we said earlier that Class D airspace only exists when the associated control tower is in operation. Now, we said earlier that if the controller closes down the tower, turns out the light, shuts the door, and goes home, Class D airspace no longer exists. Well, you might ask, what happens to it? Well, if weather reporting service is still available, including automatic weather reporting, then Class D may turn into Class E, in which case you can think of these blue lines as being magenta lines. And then you have Class E airspace. Now, if no official weather reporting exists, then the Class E airspace completely goes away, leaving Class G airspace at the surface. Now, let's take a look at the next level of airspace, and that is Class C airspace. You can think crowded or congested, because these are areas where the traffic count or passenger count is so high that they have radar service. So let's take a look at Class C airspace. The way it is shown on an aeronautical chart is with a solid magenta line instead of a dashed magenta line, and when you see that, you know it's Class C, it's crowded, and you look for the solid magenta lines. Now, to enter Class C airspace, you must establish two-way communications, and when you do that, you're going to get radar service. Now, we said two-way communications must be established, but you do not have to have a clearance, just two-way radio communications to enter Class C airspace. What do you mean no clearance? Well, if you call up a controller and say, this is Comanche 7153 Papa, and he says 7153 Papa, stand by, you have established two-way communications. You don't need a clearance, and you can go ahead and enter Class C airspace. Now, if that controller is very, very busy, and he really doesn't want to take time to deal with you right now, generally they will be smarter than that. The controller would normally say to you, Comanche 7153 Papa, stand by and remain clear of the Class C airspace. Now, he has issued you an instruction, and you cannot operate contrary to that controller's instruction. So if he says stay clear, now you have to stay clear of the airspace. So you don't have to have a clearance, but if he says stay clear, you do have to stay clear. Now, do you have to have any equipment to fly in Class C? Well, yes. In addition to the two-way radio, you must have a transponder with Mode C or altitude reporting capability, both in the Class C airspace and above it up to 10,000 feet. Now, this Class C airspace comes in real life, all different sizes and shapes, but there is kind of a standard size and shape. So let's talk about the standard size and shape. First of all, Class C airspace surrounds a primary airport, and then there is an inner circle that goes out 5 nautical miles. This is called the surface area. It goes from the surface to normally 4,000 feet above the airport elevation. To find the exact size of that inner circle, you look to see what it says. Here it says it goes from the surface to 4,600 feet MSL. In some cases, that may not be 4,000 feet above the airport elevation, but generally it is. But you need to check out the height of that. Now, beyond the surface area, from 5 miles to 10 nautical miles is the shelf area. The shelf area normally goes from 1,200 feet above the surface to 4,000 feet above the airport elevation. They will once again show you these elevations here. It's 2,000 feet at the base of the shelf area, going up to 4,600 feet in this particular case. Now, out here for another 10 miles is what is known as the outer area. They do not show the outer area on the chart because it is not mandatory for you to call them before you get in this outer area out here, but it is the area in which to call them so that you have for certain established communications before you get into this Class C airspace itself. Now, let's you and I get airborne, and let's take a look at what Class C airspace might look like if we could see it from the air. First of all, you have that surface area that starts at the surface and goes to 4,000 feet, and it has a radius of 5 nautical miles. Once again, it goes to 4,000 feet. And next you have the shelf area, and the shelf area starts at 1,200 feet above the ground level on a standard shape and goes up to 4,000 feet above the airport. And not charted is that outer area out there. So there's what that giant toadstool in the sky would look like if you could see it from the air. Now, even though there is a standard size and shape to Class C airspace, you cannot count on that as a pilot. Here's a good example of why you cannot count on it. This is Southern California. This is Marine Corps Air Station El Toro. This is John Wayne Airport at Santa Ana, California. And there's one great big Class C area. Now, you say to yourself, Class C, no problem. I'll just climb above 4,000 feet and top it out. Here's why you can't do that. Notice as we take a close look on the left side of this Class C airspace at John Wayne, Orange County Airport, the elevation of this airport is 54 feet. So if you go 4,000 feet above that, it'd be about 4,000 or 4,100 feet. But the top of this Class C airspace is 4,400 feet. So you can see that that wouldn't work. You can't top it there at 4,000 because it goes to 4,400. But hold the phone. If you look at this segment over here, you can see that the top goes clear up to 5,400 feet. So that wouldn't work either. So you just can't go to 4,000 feet and top them out. Besides that, the sizes and shapes of these things are not standard, because if you look at this, there's a cutout here in this particular case, so we don't have the outer circle here, and there's a cutout here probably for the LA Class B and over here for the mountains. So you cannot assume a standard size and shape to Class C airspace. Now, in some cases in Class C, there will be a little dashed line going along that is an extension of Class E airspace. Well, you look at this and you could get confused. You could think, well, do I have to establish communications before I fly in this area? And the answer is no, you don't, because it's a dashed line. It's a Class E airspace. This is Class C airspace here with a solid magenta line. So you can fly across this end without establishing two-way communications, or even underneath the floor here. The floor in this particular area is 7,200 feet. You could fly underneath that floor and fly through this dashed line without establishing communications. Well, what's this here for? Well, it just simply provides controlled airspace all the way down to the ground, but it's not Class C airspace, it's Class E airspace. So to look for Class C airspace, look for that solid magenta line like so. Now, let's assume that there is a satellite airport inside Class C airspace. Here's a good example. Here's a secondary airport inside Class C airspace. And let's assume that you want to take off, but you cannot establish communications on the ground. What will you do? And the answer is you have to establish communications as soon as is practicable after takeoff. Now, here's another case that is very similar but a little bit different, because notice we have an airport that would be inside the Class C airspace, except they made a little cutout, and it's not in Class C airspace. Now, can I take off from this particular airport and establish communications as soon as it is practicable? And the answer is no, you cannot, because you would then be entering the Class C airspace. You're not in Class C airspace, so you would have to fly away from the Class C airspace and then establish communications before entering it. So in this particular case, even though you would be within, say, 5 nautical miles of the airport, you still cannot wait until it's practicable to call them, because you are not in it and you cannot enter it without establishing two-way communications. Now, what do you expect from Class C airspace? Well, you expect sequencing of arrivals. Whether you're VFR or IFR, they're going to sequence you to the airport, and that means line you all up on final so you're coming in order. And you can also expect some separation service. How much? Well, if there are 2 IFR airplanes, the separation service 2 IFR airplanes could expect from each other is standard separation. But if it's an IFR airplane being separated from a VFR airplane, these 2 aircraft only get advisories, Comanche 7153 Pop, you have traffic at 2 o'clock, and conflict resolution. And conflict resolution only provides 500 feet of vertical separation and what the controllers refer to as green between. And green between means you just cannot let the 2 targets merge on the radar scope. And folks, that is not much separation. They call that conflict resolution. Now, 2 VFR aircraft being separated from each other could expect advisories, and they don't even get conflict resolution. They get safety alerts. Now, conflict resolution, the controller will give you headings and altitudes to make sure that he keeps green between and gives you 500-foot separation. But safety alerts, they don't even go that far. All they do is give you warnings of unsafe proximity or closeness to other aircraft and terrain and obstructions. So if they think you're too close, they're going to give you a safety alert, which is the equivalent of saying, watch out. So you do not have absolute separation in Class C airspace. Now let's you and I think big. Let's talk about Class B airspace. And you know that's big airports, big airplanes, and big airspace. Let's take a look at how Class B airspace is shown on an aeronautical chart. When you see Class B airspace, you're going to see blue solid lines like this. And when you see that, you know that's Class B airspace, and you have to have a clearance to enter this airspace. And look for the magic words, cleared in the Class B airspace. you must hear those magic words. Now, these Class B airspace areas are established around the very busiest airports. Airports like Los Angeles International, New York's Kennedy, Chicago's O'Hare. And the size and shape of each Class B airspace is different. You have to look at the map of each individual one to see what it's going to look like. And to do that, you look at these solid blue lines. And when you get in close, you can see the elevations that there are for the Class B airspace. Normally, Class B airspace involves at least one primary airport, several secondary airports, and near the airport, Class B airspace goes all the way down to the surface. And you can look underneath this line. It tells you what the floor of it is. Here, in this case, it's the surface. The top of the line tells you the ceiling of the Class B airspace. Here, it's 12,500 feet. Now, typically, as you get away from the airport, the floor of the Class B airspace rises. Here it's 2,000 feet. We might go out a little further and we'll see it's higher. Here's 2,500. Here's 4,000. So the floor of the Class B airspace rises as you get away from the airport. Now, let's you and I get airborne, and we'll take a look at what Class B airspace might look like from the cockpit window, if you could see it. First of all, near the airport, Class B airspace goes all the way down to the ground. And as you move from the airport, the floors get higher. They go from 2,000 to 2,500, 4,000, 6,000. And then when you're on final approach to the airport, you're looking at this from the end, and that's what it might look like when you're on final to Los Angeles International Airport, landing to the west. Now, you must have a clearance to fly anywhere inside this Class B airspace. But you can fly over the top without a clearance, and you can fly underneath without a clearance. You just must have a clearance to fly anywhere inside Class B airspace. So let's take a look at what you have to fly inside Class B airspace. First of all, you must have that ATC clearance, and look for those magic words, cleared to enter Class B airspace. With a few exceptions, which we'll talk about later, you must be a private pilot to fly in Class B airspace. You must also have communications radio. You've got to be able to talk with them. And if you're IFR, you have to have an operable VOR or TACAN receiver. But if you're VFR, you do not have to have any specific navigation equipment. You, of course, do have to be able to follow a clearance, but you don't have to have VOR or TACAN. It could be GPS or LORAN, or you might be able to navigate by looking outside the window reliably, but you have to be able to navigate some way. And in Class B airspace, you must have a transponder with Mode C. And that's not the only transponder requirement associated with Class B airspace, because if you look way out here, some 30 nautical miles away from the primary airport, you see this circle way out here, 30 miles away, and that's called the Mode C veil. And you can see it on a chart around Class B airspace. Now, what that Mode C veil tells you is that you must have a transponder when you're within 30 nautical miles of the primary airport from the surface up to 10,000 feet MSL. And that transponder must be equipped with Mode C, and that's within 30 nautical miles of any Class B type airport. So that is an additional transponder requirement. An exception is aircraft that look like this. This is an aircraft that was originally certificated without, whoa, that's getting close, isn't it, folks? Originally certificated without any electrical system. Well, if the aircraft originally was built without any electrical system and certificated that way, then you can fly without a transponder in Mode C as long as you stay outside of B and C airspace and stay below a ceiling of the B or C airspace or below 10,000 feet MSL, whichever is lower. So aircraft like this, originally certificated without an electrical system, have that exception. Now, I said earlier, you must be a private pilot to fly inside Class B airspace. Well, there are some exceptions. A student pilot may fly solo in Class B airspace if they have logged ground and flight instruction in the specific Class B airspace that they're going to fly in and at the specific airport they will be taking off or landing from. And in addition to that, they must have an endorsement in their logbook showing that within the last 90 days,
they are competent to solo in Class B and land at that specific airport, and that logbook endorsement must have been made within the last 90 days. But even if a student meets all of these requirements, they still cannot fly solo at these listed Class B airspace airports, but can in the associated airspace, and that's Atlanta Hartsfield, Boston Logan, Chicago O'Hare, Dallas Fort Worth Airport, Los Angeles International, Miami International, Newark International, JFK Airport in New York or New York's LaGuardia, San Francisco International, Washington, D.C. National Airport, and Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland. So when you think Class B airspace, think big. And remember that you must have a clearance to fly inside that Class B airspace. And of course, you've got to meet the transponder requirements and the navigation requirements for Class B airspace. Now, let's you and I take a look at the last one on our list, Class A airspace. And think altitude, because we're talking about 18,000 feet and above, and we're really talking about the 48 contiguous states and Alaska. So if you look at the 48 contiguous states and Alaska, and it's really parts of Alaska, and think of 18,000 feet up to flight level 600, that is Class A airspace. 18,000 feet up to flight level 600. Now, what do you know about Class A airspace? Well, they keep track of every single airplane that flies in Class A airspace. So to fly in Class A airspace, you must be instrument rated and current, instrument equipped on an IFR clearance, and at an altitude assigned by ATC, and you must have a transponder with Mode C. In other words, they keep track of every single airplane flying in Class A airspace, so you know that you have separation from all aircraft in Class A airspace. So that's Class A airspace. Let's wrap up our understanding of the entire international airspace system, because you know now that when you see A, you're going to think altitude. When you see B, you're going to think big. When you see C, you're going to think crowded or congested. When you see D, you're going to think dialogue. When you see E, you're going to think elsewhere. And when you see G, you're going to think go for it. And now that we have this in hand, you and I are both true citizens of the international aviation community.
Let's see if we can make some sense out of the rules about where a transponder with Mode C, which is the altitude reporting, are required. First of all, you need the transponder with the altitude reporting if you're operating in Class A airspace. That's 18,000 feet up to flight level 600. Secondly, you need it if you're in Class B and C airspace. B is shown by the solid blue line, C by the solid magenta lines on the chart, in Class B and C airspace, and above the ceilings of those airspaces up to 10,000 feet MSL. Number 3, you need the transponder with the altitude reporting if you're within 30 nautical miles of a Class B primary airport, and you need it from the surface up to 10,000 feet MSL. Now remember, we have an exception to that 30 nautical mile veil, as we discussed earlier, and that's for aircraft without an electrical system. They are exempted from the transponder requirement in the 30 nautical mile veil. Number 4 on where you need the transponder with the altitude reporting is at and above 10,000 feet MSL in the 48 states if you're more than 2,500 feet AGL, unless your aircraft was certificated without an electrical system, in which case you don't have to worry about that. But what if you're having problems with your transponder? What if your transponder isn't working? If your transponder is not working, air traffic control can immediately authorize operation to your ultimate destination, including intermediate stops, or to someplace where the transponder can be repaired. If the altitude reporting part of your transponder is not working, again, air traffic control can immediately authorize your operation so that you don't have to quit and land and so on just because the altitude reporting quit. But what if your aircraft was never equipped with a transponder in the first place? If you want to operate in an airspace where the transponder and altitude reporting is required, but your aircraft was never equipped with one, air traffic control can authorize that operation, but you have to request it at least 1 hour before the proposed operation. Let's talk now about speed limits. There are some speed limits in the sky. First of all, let's talk about at and above 10,000 feet MSL. At and above 10,000 feet MSL, there is no speed limit. So if your grandma wants to run around up there in her Learjet at 500 miles an hour at 10,000 feet, no problem, because there's no speed limit up there. But below 10,000 feet MSL, there gets to be quite a bit of traffic, including relatively slow traffic. So the general speed limit below 10,000 feet MSL is 250 knots indicated airspeed. 250 knots indicated airspeed. Now, there's no special speed limit in Class B airspace. If you're in Class B airspace, it's just like any other airspace. If you're at or above 10,000 feet MSL, there's no speed limit. If you're below 10,000 feet MSL, your speed limit is 250 knots indicated airspeed. Where there is a speed limit is under Class B airspace. It's 200 knots indicated airspeed. And that's because there's a lot of traffic jammed up under there trying to get around the edges of Class B without having all the requirements to actually go through it. Now, another place relating to Class B airspace with a speed limit is a VFR corridor through Class B airspace that also has a speed limit of 200 knots indicated airspeed within the Class B corridor. How about Class C and D airspace? With Class C or D airspace, you have an indicated airspeed limit of 200 knots if you are within a 4 nautical mile radius of the primary airport in Class C or D airspace, up to 2,500 feet above the airport surface. Speed limit there is 200 knots indicated airspeed. Let's review these different airspeed limits. At or above 10,000 feet, no speed limit. Below 10,000 feet, 250 knots indicated airspeed. Under Class B or in a VFR corridor through Class B, 200 knots. And within 4 nautical miles of the primary airport in Class C or D airspace, at or below 2,500 feet, 200 knots. The reason that we have different classes of airspace, uncontrolled and controlled airspace, is to provide safe operating space for aircraft depending on the density of traffic and the services that are available. Now, in Class G airspace, uncontrolled airspace, you can go for it in Class G airspace because there's not many IFR flights in that area and practically no services either. On the other hand, in controlled airspace, Class E on up, in controlled airspace, IFR aircraft routinely go in and out of the clouds, and so VFR aircraft are going to need higher visibility and cloud clearance requirements in order for them to operate safely. So let's take a look at exactly what our weather minimums are. First of all, in uncontrolled airspace, Class G airspace during the day. In Class G airspace in the daytime, as long as you're operating at or below 1,200 feet above ground level, your weather minimums are pretty darn minimum. All you have to do in terms of clouds is maintain clear of clouds, and your visibility requirement is only 1 statute mile for fixed-wing aircraft. For helicopters, you don't even have to worry about that as long as you don't hit anything, but 1 statute mile for fixed-wing aircraft and clear of clouds, as long as you stay at or below 1,200 feet AGL in Class G uncontrolled airspace in the daytime. How about controlled airspace or Class G at night? In controlled airspace, Class E airspace, or in Class G at night, they want you to have more cloud clearance and better visibility. In the controlled airspace Class E, you're much more likely to have IFR airplanes coming popping out of those clouds, so they want some distance from those clouds and some better visibility. And at night, it's just more hazardous, so at night, even if you're in uncontrolled airspace, you have to have the same weather minimums as you would in Class E controlled airspace. So what cloud clearance do you have to have? 500 feet below the clouds, 1,000 feet above the clouds, and 2,000 feet horizontally from the clouds. And the easy way to remember that is start with the 500 feet below the clouds and just keep doubling it. 500 feet below the clouds, double it for 1,000 feet above the clouds, double that for 2,000 feet horizontally from the clouds. And the visibility that you have to have is 3 statute miles visibility. What if you're operating above 1,200 feet AGL in Class G uncontrolled airspace? If you are above 1,200 feet AGL up to 10,000 feet MSL, it's somewhat more likely that you're going to have IFR airplanes coming out of the clouds there. Not real likely, but somewhat more. They're more likely, certainly, than below 1,200 feet AGL, because down there they might hit the ground. If you're operating above 1,200 feet AGL up to 10,000 feet MSL in Class G airspace in the daytime, you need the same cloud clearance that you would in controlled airspace, 500 feet below the clouds, 1,000 feet above the clouds, and 2,000 feet horizontally from the clouds. The difference is, from controlled airspace, that you still only have to have that 1 statute mile visibility. So in Class G airspace in the daytime, above 1,200 feet AGL up to 10,000 feet MSL, you need to be 500 feet below the clouds, 1,000 feet above the clouds, 2,000 feet horizontally, but you still only need 1 statute mile visibility. In Class E airspace, which is controlled airspace, you've got those same cloud clearances, the same ones that you had below 1,200 feet AGL, and you've got the same visibility that you had down lower. In Class E airspace, up to 10,000 feet, you've got to be 500 feet below the clouds, 1,000 feet above the clouds, and 2,000 feet horizontally from the clouds, and 3 statute miles visibility. In Class E airspace, it really doesn't make any difference whether you're above or below 1,200 feet AGL. The important thing here is that you're below 10,000 feet MSL. In both Class G and Class E airspace, your weather minimums change when you get at and above 10,000 feet MSL. And why is that? Because at and above 10,000 feet MSL, there isn't any speed limit. Airplanes can go as fast as they want to up there, and if they're going to be doing that, then you're going to need, as a VFR aircraft, some more clearance from the clouds and some better visibility. So regardless of whether you're operating in Class G airspace or Class E airspace, if you are operating at and above 10,000 feet MSL, your cloud clearance is a whole bunch of ones. 1,000 feet below the clouds, 1,000 feet above the clouds, and 1 mile horizontally from the clouds in both Class G and Class E airspace. And how about your visibility requirement? Your visibility requirement in either case is 5 statute miles on that visibility requirement. Now, as far as the night operations in G airspace are concerned, we said that they are the same as controlled airspace as if you were operating in E airspace. That is true with one exception, and that is if you're in the traffic pattern of an airport, provided that you are operating at and below 1,200 feet AGL. In Class G airspace, even at night, you can continue to operate with clear of clouds and 1 mile visibility, provided that you're basically in the traffic pattern for the airport, and the FAA defines that as within 1/2 mile of the airport runway. That's Class G and Class E airspace. What about Classes C and D airspace? In Classes C and D airspace, a type of controlled airspace, the cloud clearances are the same that we've been talking about: 500 feet below the clouds, 1,000 feet above the clouds, 2,000 feet horizontally, and the visibility is the same that we've been talking about, 3 statute miles visibility. The difference here is it does not make any difference what altitude you are, how high above the ground you are, whether or not you're above 10,000 feet. If you're in Class C and Class D airspace, everyone will be communicating with the controller, and so you have the same cloud clearance requirements: 500 feet below, 1,000 feet above, and 2,000 feet horizontally, and the same visibility, 3 statute miles visibility, regardless of what your altitude is relative to the surface or relative to MSL. How about Class B airspace? Class B airspace is where our big aircraft are, and everybody is operating on a clearance from the controller, and you've got to get permission to enter there. In Class B airspace, you need the 3 miles visibility, but in Class B airspace, because the controller is separating everybody from everybody else, you don't have to maintain a certain distance from clouds because you're not the one watching out to separate yourself from other aircraft. All you have to do is operate clear of clouds. So in Class B airspace, you need 3 miles visibility, 3 statute miles, but you do not have to worry about cloud clearance. All you have to do is operate clear of clouds because the controller is separating all of the aircraft from each other. Now suppose that you want to operate into or out of an airport and they've got a ceiling, a cloud layer over that airport. How high does that ceiling have to be? In either a Class B, C, D, or E surface area, meaning where that airspace touches the surface of the earth, if you're going to operate underneath the ceiling in a Class B, C, D, or E surface area, you have to have 3 statute miles visibility, and the ceiling height has to be 1,000 feet above the Earth's surface if you're going to operate VFR in that area. But what if the weather is worse than a 1,000-foot ceiling and 3 miles visibility? How do you get in and out of the airport then? You can still do it VFR with what's known as a special VFR clearance, and you do have to get a clearance to actually do it. Special VFR operations allow aircraft operations in controlled airspace, meaning airspace other than Class G airspace, in weather conditions that are less than basic VFR weather minimums. And we'll talk about how much less in just a minute. When you get a special VFR clearance, the controller will be separating you from other aircraft. So essentially what a special VFR clearance does is provides IFR separation to you even though you're not in IFR operation. Now, in order to conduct a special VFR operation, the pilot must request it. Special VFR has to be requested by the pilot, and it has to be approved by air traffic control, either a control tower, approach control, or center. If there's no tower at the airport, you can ask flight service, if there is a flight service there, for the special VFR clearance, and they can relay it, the request, to air traffic control to get that approval for you. Now, air traffic control will not volunteer special VFR clearances to you because you can operate in fairly bad weather, and they're not going to encourage you. They're not going to push you to do that. But if you, the pilot, ask for it, they will give it to you unless that clearance is going to conflict with IFR operations that are going in and out of that airport. Because if there are IFR operations, they will have priority, and they'll just kind of fit you in as they get a chance. But if you're not a conflict with IFR traffic and you ask for special VFR, the controller must give it to you, provided the weather conditions are okay, which we'll talk about. Now take a look at this sectional chart with the Tucumcari Airport. Notice that Tucumcari does not have a control tower, but it does have a flight service station. And around Tucumcari is surface area Class E airspace. And we know that because of the dashed magenta line around the airport area, surface area of Class E airspace. That is one of the places where special VFR is allowed. Special VFR operations are allowed within the lateral boundaries of the surface areas of Class B, C, D, or E airspace up to but not including 10,000 feet MSL. And what we mean by the surface areas is where those airspace areas actually touch the earth. Within the lateral limits of those surface areas, up to but not including 10,000 feet for Class B, C, D, or E airspace, you can request and receive a special VFR clearance. Now, what kind of requirements do you have to have for that special VFR? Well, first of all, as we said, you have to have a clearance from the appropriate air traffic controller, tower or approach control or center. And if you're not able to raise ATC directly yourself, if there's a flight service available, then you can ask for that and they'll relay the request through the flight service station. What kind of weather do you have to have for special VFR? Not very much. The weather minimums that you have to have are for fixed-wing aircraft, 1 statute mile visibility and clear of clouds. If you're operating in a helicopter, you can get special VFR without any visibility requirement as long as you don't hit anything. But for airplanes, 1 statute mile visibility and clear of clouds. That is not very good weather, and that's why the controller will not suggest special VFR. He's not going to push you that way, but if you ask for it, it is a way to get in and out of that airport. Now, if you want a special VFR clearance at night, the pilot has to be instrument rated and the airplane has to be instrument equipped. That does not apply to helicopters, but it does apply to airplanes. So for special VFR, you need a clearance from ATC. Your weather minimums are 1 statute mile visibility for airplanes and clear of clouds. And if it's nighttime, the pilot has to be instrument rated and the airplane has to be instrument equipped. Now, let's take a look at Tucumcari and talk about exactly how that special VFR clearance is going to sound. Let's suppose that you're coming into the Tucumcari Airport from the east and you want a special VFR clearance in because you've got less than 3 miles visibility or less than a 1,000-foot ceiling. There's no control tower at Tucumcari, so you can call the flight service station and they'll simply relay your request and relay the clearance. So you'd say, Tucumcari radio, Comanche 7153 Papa is 10 miles east requesting special VFR clearance for landing Tucumcari. Tucumcari will pick up the phone, call whatever ATC facility handles that airspace, and relay their clearance back to you. And the clearance might sound like this.
ATC clears Comanche 7153 Papa to the Tucumcari Airport from the east, maintains special VFR conditions at or below 5,500 feet.
And that clears you to come in from the east and enter the traffic pattern and land at Tucumcari. And you will have separation from all other aircraft in there because if the weather is less than that 1,000-foot ceiling and 3 miles visibility, because this is a surface area, Class E airspace area, there's not supposed to be any VFR aircraft in there unless they've received a special VFR clearance. Now, what if you want to get out of Tucumcari instead? Sitting on the ground in the ramp area, you call the flight service and say, we'd like to depart Tucumcari eastbound with a special VFR clearance. Tucumcari Flight Service calls up ATC. ATC gives a clearance, which the flight service relays and says,
ATC clears Comanche 7153 Papa from the Tucumcari Airport to the east, maintains special VFR conditions at or below 5,500 feet.
Now, when you request a special VFR clearance, you want to have a pencil in your hand because they will give you a clearance, a direction to come in from, and usually an altitude to stay at or below. And you read that back to them so they know that you got it correct. And if you're departing, you want to make sure that you cancel that clearance. Let them know when you're out. They will usually say, report leaving the Class E or whatever class airspace it is, surface area, and that way they know that you're clear and that that airspace is available again for IFR operations. Now, here's something you've got to watch out for. This special VFR clearance is only good within the lateral boundaries of the surface area of B, C, D, or E airspace. What happens when you get outside of those lateral boundaries? Outside of the lateral boundaries of that surface area, a special VFR clearance is not valid. In that case, if you're in controlled airspace, you again have to have your 3 miles visibility. So watch out for that. You need to be able to figure out how you're going to operate once you get outside this surface area, not just in it itself. Now, at some airports the size of, say, Indianapolis, Columbus, Ohio, Cincinnati, at some airports, there's no way that a special VFR clearance will not delay IFR traffic because they've got so much IFR traffic. And if you will delay IFR traffic, they're not going to give you a special VFR clearance. So at some busy airports, when you look at the airport information, you'll see a note that says no SVFR, no special VFR, meaning that no special VFR clearances for fixed-wing aircraft. Helicopters okay, but none for fixed wing will be issued. They're simply so busy that you would delay IFR traffic, so they put a note right on the chart to tell you, don't even ask for it. It's not possible. They're not going to give it to you. No special VFR clearances for fixed wing aircraft. Let's take a look now at the New York terminal area chart and zero in on Kennedy Airport on JFK Airport. And when you take a look at the airport information, the name, John F. Kennedy International Airport, you'll notice has a box around it. Now, the box around an airport name means that it is what's known as a Part 93 airport, which means there's some sort of regulatory requirement having to do with that airport. Well, in the case of John F. Kennedy Airport and some others, what it means is it is a high traffic density airport. A high traffic density airport means that you need a reservation slot for an IFR departure or arrival. This includes airports like JFK Airport and LaGuardia in New York, Newark Airport in New Jersey, O'Hare Airport in Chicago, and Ronald Reagan National in Washington, D.C. So for airports like these, that box around the airport name means that it is a high traffic density airport, and you're going to need an IFR reservation slot for either an arrival or a departure. Sometimes, though, the box around the airport name can have a different significance. For instance, take a look at Lorain County, Ohio. Lorain County, Ohio also has a box around the airport name. Now, it still means that it is a Part 93 airport with some kind of regulatory requirement. But in the case of Lorain County Regional, it is not because it's a high traffic density airport. What is it because of? Well, where do you suppose we could find out? In the Airport Facility Directory. So you take a look at the Airport Facility Directory for Lorain County, Ohio, and in the airport remarks, it says Special Air Traffic Rules Part 93. Well, we knew that. And then it says, see regulatory notices. They aren't going to tell us here what the deal is. What we have to do is go to the back of the airport facility directory and take a look at those regulatory notices. And when you take a look at the regulatory notices, you find that Lorain County Airport has a special airport traffic rule. And the reason for that rule when you go down through it is because Oberlin Music College is there, and what they want you to do is avoid flight north of the airport so that you stay away from that music college. So whenever you see an airport with a box around the airport name, what it means is that it's a Part 93 airport and there's some kind of regulatory requirement about it. It could be a high traffic density airport if it's like one of those we named, or it could be something else having to do with some kind of special traffic pattern because, as in this case, the music college is nearby. Some of the other airports, like Lorain County, that have special traffic rules are Anchorage and Ketchikan, Alaska, Valparaiso, Florida, and a few others. Take a look again at the sectional chart with the Tucumcari Airport on it, and let's talk about an airport advisory area. Now, airport advisory areas are not shown on the chart. Airport advisory areas exist within 10 statute miles of a non-control tower airport that does have an active flight service station on the field. And what happens in an airport advisory area is that the flight service station personnel provide traffic advisories for inbound and outbound aircraft. Participation by the aircraft is voluntary, but they strongly encourage it, and the reason is so that other aircraft will know where you are and so that the flight service station can help kind of coordinate traffic and let everybody know where everybody else is. You would call the flight service station and advise them of what's going on and ask for their advisories before you start taxiing, before takeoff, if you're inbound about 10 miles out, in order to find out the traffic information at the airport. Now, in an airport advisory area, there is no equipment requirement. You do not have to have a transponder. You don't even have to have a communications radio if you don't want to, because the participation by the aircraft in the advisory service is voluntary. You would only have to have a communications radio and if you wanted to get advisories. If you don't care about them, you can still go in and out of that airport without a communications radio. Now, what frequency are you going to get this local airport advisory on? They print it right there on the chart, but for the airport advisory areas, it's frequency 123.6 that you call the flight service on and get information about traffic in the local airport area. Let's take a look now at the Palm Springs area. In the Palm Springs area, we have a different type of airspace area that is marked on the chart. It's a Terminal Radar Service Area, or TRSA, T-R-S-A, or Terminal Radar Service Area. Now, terminal radar service areas are essentially a holdover from the previous airspace system. There's quite a few of them around, but they probably eventually will end up as Class C airspace. Terminal radar service areas are shown on the chart by a solid black or charcoaly looking line around the airspace that is inside that TRSA. They come in all different sizes and shapes. They're drawn on the chart, so you just look at it and see, and they give you floors and ceilings of where that TRSA airspace is. For instance, close to the Palm Springs Airport, the terminal radar service area goes from the surface up to 10,000 feet. Somewhat further away, it goes from 2,000 feet up to 10,000 feet. That's the area within which Palm Springs Radar Approach Control can give you advisory information. Aircraft participation is voluntary. VFR participation with the TRSA radar service is voluntary. You can either choose to get their help or you can choose not to, depending on what you prefer. But it's strongly recommended that you do, simply because it's a lot safer to know where all of the other aircraft are. So what kind of service are you going to get in a terminal radar service area? The controller will provide you with advisories, with sequencing to the airport, and with separation between participating VFR aircraft and all IFR aircraft within the terminal radar service area. And it's important to remember that the separation you're going to get is between participating VFR aircraft and also IFR aircraft, because this is a voluntary service as far as the aircraft are concerned. They do not have to participate, and it's very difficult for the controller to separate some aircraft if there are others that are not participating in the service. Now, the separation that the controller can use, visual separation can be used when conditions permit, when the weather is good enough for aircraft to be able to see and locate and avoid each other that way. As far as the equipment and the weather minima requirements in that TERSA, they're determined by whatever class of airspace is contained in that area. It could be Class D airspace, it could be Class E airspace, it could even be Class G airspace. And so whatever kind of equipment and weather minima are required, you just look at what kind of airspace you've got, whether it's D or E or G. And as I said, the terminal radar service areas probably will eventually become Class C airspace. Now, John is going to cover the many different ins and outs of special use airspace.
Let's talk about special use airspace. And special use airspace is airspace with some limitation to your ability to fly in that area, generally due to some activity that just might be hazardous to your health. Something like this, where dangerous activities are taking place, or sometimes special use airspace is established because of protecting the national security or the national welfare. For instance, one type of special use airspace is a prohibited area. They have a prohibited area over the White House in Washington, D.C. They have a prohibited area over the Capitol building in the mall, and a prohibited area is shown with these lines with hash marks and P in a number, and this is an example of a prohibited area. You are flat out prohibited from flying in a prohibited area. But normally, special use airspace is established for reasons of your own health. For instance, in restricted areas, they do things that might be hazardous to your health, like space shuttle shots, things like that. And around these things, because it's very hard for a Cessna 150 to keep up with the space shuttle, since that is the case, they establish a restricted area around these kinds of activities, and you can fly in a restricted area. It's not wholly prohibited for you to fly in a restricted area, but they post the times a dangerous activity takes place, and you can fly through there any time other than the times posted or by getting permission from the appropriate authority. Now, you can see where there's a restricted area because you'll see R in a number, and you'll see these lines with the hash marks, and that tells you there's a restricted area, and it denotes the existence of unusual, sometimes invisible hazards, such as artillery fire, aerial gunnery, guided missiles, and so on. Things like that can ruin your whole doggone day. So you'd like to know when this is happening, so what you can do is go to the legend on the chart. So let's take a look at the legend on the chart, and you'll see on the legend on the chart, they'll give you the name or number of the restricted area. They'll give you the geographic location of the restricted area, the altitudes it goes to, and when the restricted area activity, the activity that causes a restricted area, might be happening, and they'll tell you by NOTAM here, continuous here, by NOTAM here, and you can fly through here other than the times the dangerous activity is taking place, or you can fly through here by permission from the controlling authority. And that is a restricted area, and they are established for reasons of your own health. Another kind of special use airspace is warning areas. Now, in warning areas, they do things like this. They fire heat-seeking missiles. They do machine gunning, bombing, strafing. You might say, wait a minute, aren't those the same kind of activities that take place in a restricted area? And the answer is yes, they're exactly the same. The only difference is a warning area is out to sea in international territory beyond the 12-mile limit, and they cannot keep you from flying in international territory. So you can fly in a warning area any old time you want to. Probably only once. Warning areas are shown on the chart just like restricted areas with blue lines with hash marks, except when it's a warning area it says W and a number instead of R and a number. Now, it used to be that international airspace started 3 miles out instead of 12 miles out, so in between 3 and 12 miles they still have warning areas, but they're established by a special Federal Aviation regulation. So it's a warning area all the same, and you can fly in it anytime you want to, just like any other warning area, probably once. Another kind of special use airspace is a military operations area. For short, these are called MOAs. And these MOAs are established to keep IFR airplanes separated from military training activities that might include acrobatic or abrupt flight maneuvers. And so they are shown on the chart so that you will know they are there. They're shown with these magenta lines with the hash marks. They are also labeled. For instance, this is the Pecos West High MOA. Now, these are designed to keep IFR airplanes separated from this activity that the military is doing that might be hazardous. However, IFR traffic may actually be cleared through an MOA if IFR separation can be provided by air traffic control. If, on the other hand, IFR separation cannot be provided by ATC, they will route the IFR airplane around the MOA. Now, a VFR airplane can fly through an MOA any time they want to, but according to the FAA, a VFR pilot should exercise extreme caution while flying through an MOA during the times the military activity is taking place, and I think that is a wonderful idea. It's always a good idea to exercise extreme caution. Now, if you want to obtain real-time information concerning the hours of operation on an MOA, you can contact any flight service station within 100 miles of the area. And the FAA says before you enter an active MOA, it's a good idea to contact the controlling agency and get traffic advisories while you're flying in there. Another kind of area we want to talk about is an alert area. Now, alert areas contain a high volume of pilot training or an unusual type of aerial activity, including high-performance climbs and descents, and they post these alert areas on the chart because they thought you would want to know. Now, you as a pilot can fly through an alert area any time you want to. But the FAA says you should be especially alert when you fly through alert areas. That's why they call them alert areas. Now, let's assume that there's a military airplane in here and you are flying in here. Who is responsible for avoiding a collision? And the answer is all pilots, including the participating pilots, also including the non-participating pilots. All pilots are equally responsible for collision avoidance, so the message in alert area is look outside that window. Now, another kind of airspace is a controlled firing area. Let's take a look at the kind of activity that takes place in a controlled firing area. This is the kind of activity that takes place in a controlled firing area. We're talking about a small-scale war here, folks. Now, the interesting thing about a controlled firing area is they do not show these areas on aeronautical charts anywhere. You can't find them. Why wouldn't they show something like this on an aeronautical chart? Well, the reason is they have spotter aircraft, radar, ground lookout positions, and what they do is watch for aircraft that might be coming, and when they spot some aircraft, they suspend the activity. This is wonderful. This is the only area we've talked about that does not require non-participating aircraft to change their flight plans. You just keep on coming and they quit their activity, and it works fantastic unless you happen to be flying a stealth today. Then it doesn't work so well. Let's take a look at military training routes. Now, military training routes are established to conduct for the military low-altitude, high-speed training. By low altitude, we're talking about 200 to 300 feet AGL. And by high speed, we're talking about speeds in excess of 250 knots indicated airspeed. We're talking about high-speed, low-altitude bomber runs, folks. So if you're in a Cessna 150 flying along and you see an airplane fly underneath you at these kinds of speeds, it scares the daylights out of you. Now, non-participating aircraft are not prohibited from flying in these military training routes. You can fly through here anytime you want to. However, the FAA thinks extreme vigilance should be exercised when you're conducting flight through these areas or near these areas. So how do you find out what's going on and when these activities are taking place on these military training routes? You contact a flight service station within 100 nautical miles of a particular military training route to obtain current information. The kind of information you can get is the times the activity is taking place, the altitudes that are in use, and the actual width of these routes. The widths vary. Now, when you call the flight service station, you should give the specialist your route of flight, your position now, and your destination, and you do all this at one time. And the whole idea is to reduce frequency congestion, and this lets the specialist give you the information you need about the particular routes that will affect you. Now, there is a numbering system on these military training routes, and that numbering system can be very helpful to you as a pilot. First of all, you can see letters VR, and if you see the letters VR, that means the flight is limited to visual conditions. If instead you see the letter IR, like you have up here, the IR means the flight can be conducted either in visual or even instrument conditions. And notice sometimes you see 3-digit numbers and sometimes you see 4-digit numbers. That also tells you very helpful information, because if you see a 4-digit number, that means the flight must be conducted at or below 1,500 feet AGL. If, on the other hand, you see a 3-digit number, that means the flight could be at any altitude. It could be above or below 1,500 feet AGL. What is an easy way to remember this? I'll tell you an easy way to remember this. Think of this as a pyramid. The lower altitudes are the 4-digit numbers, so it rests on the 4-digit numbers. The higher altitudes, the ones that have the capability of being higher altitudes, are 3-digit numbers. So build yourself a pyramid, and you'll remember that the lower altitude flights have 4-digit numbers. Now let's take a look at another unusual piece of airspace, and this is on approach to U.S. Marine Corps El Toro. And there are climb and descent corridors because there's a lot of activity taking place in here. They want you to communicate with them, so they have made this Class D airspace. Class D, as you remember, stands for dialogue, meaning that communications is required. So here's an example of Class D airspace that has an unusual shape. It's a climb or descent corridor, so look out for unusual shaped airspace into and out of some very busy military airports. In this case, that's Class D, and dialogue is required. Now, another thing we need to talk about is the Air Defense Identification Zone. For short, that's called the ADIZ. Now, the ADIZ surrounds the entire United States, and it's there to provide defense of the United States. An aircraft entering the ADIZ must follow certain rules. We're going to talk about some of these rules. We're not going to talk about all of them. So if you actually think you may be flying in an ADIZ, you need to look up the rules in the Airman's Information Manual. The general rule is that this applies to everybody except aircraft going around Alaska and Hawaii that fly less than 180 knots are exempt from it. And what you need to do if you're going to enter an ADIZ is you must file an IFR, or what is known as a Defense VFR flight plan for all operations that enter the ADIZ. And of course, two-way radio is required for most ADIZ operations, and a transponder with altitude reporting is required unless you're operating in Alaska and Hawaii. So you have to do, first of all, if you're IFR, normal IFR position reporting, but if you're flying on a Defense VFR flight plan, you must do special position reporting, and you must report when you're going to enter the ADIZ at least 15 minutes before you do enter the ADIZ, and they take these reports pretty seriously. First of all, your position must be within, if you're over land, plus or minus 5 minutes and 10 nautical miles, and if you're over water, plus or minus 5 minutes and 20 nautical miles. So the ADIZ is something you should get very familiar with if you think you may be flying around the borders of the United States or crossing into the ADIZ. Now, another thing you need to know about is what is known as temporary flight restrictions. Once again, these won't show up on any aeronautical chart. These are issued by notice to airmen, and it's when something that is dangerous is going on, such as a forest fire or some activity that might create a lot of public interest like the America's Cup, they will issue a temporary flight restriction, and that is another good reason you should always get a weather briefing before flying, because you need to know about these temporary flight restrictions. Now, another kind of area we need to talk about is a special conservation area. Now, these areas include wildlife refuges, primitive and wilderness areas, national parks, and they're shown on the chart with a blue line with dots inside. For instance, here's the Grassy Knob Wilderness Area.
On some islands, for instance, they have wildlife refuges. In this particular case, you see the Oregon Islands National Wildlife Refuge, and it's these islands, and they have the blue lines with the dots inside. Or national parks might be shown this way. For instance, in California, you might find the Lassen Volcanic National Park, and it has a line with the dots inside of it. And those are special conservation areas. Now, one of the things you need to know about these areas is that the landing of aircraft is prohibited in these areas unless you have prior authorization. Now, the areas we're talking about is lands or waters administered by the National Park Service, the U.S. Forest Service, the Wildlife Service. You cannot land there unless you have prior authorization. Of course, you could land there if you had an emergency, so you can make emergency landings, or you can land at an approved site, or if you happen to be on official business of the U.S. government, you could land there. But otherwise, the thing you need to know is that in these areas, landings are prohibited. Another thing you need to know is that all aircraft are requested to maintain a minimum of 2,000 feet above ground level, above the surface of wildlife areas. Now, sometimes they'll make the request for another altitude. And by the way, this is a request. It's not law. However, it's a very serious request. And if you fail to maintain that altitude, when you land, very often you will be visited by a park ranger. That's what they tell me. I wouldn't know that personally. Now, sometimes the request is for some altitude other than 2,000 feet. For instance, if you look in Southern California at the condor nesting areas, and if you look at this fine print very, very closely, you find the request is for 3,000 feet in that area. Sometimes the request says fly a certain distance away. For instance, around Palomar Observatory on Palomar Mountain in Southern California, they request that you avoid the area by at least 5 miles. So there are all different kinds of requests, and a request that they do take seriously. Isn't this spectacular? What a tremendous hole in the ground. Well, of course it is. This is the Grand Canyon. You know, you'd really want to be careful walking around a place like this. Well, actually, it's not so hazardous walking around here because I'm really walking on the Grand Canyon VFR aeronautical chart. What really is hazardous around here is flying because there's a tremendous amount of traffic in the Grand Canyon area. So much so, in fact, that the FAA has established the Grand Canyon Special Flight Rules Area. And that's what this VFR aeronautical chart in the Grand Canyon area is all about. Let's take a look at the Grand Canyon Special Flight Rules. First of all, the whole area is bounded by this blue line with little squares, and it's broken into sectors. The sector on the left-hand side here is the Pierce Ferry sector. Here you can't fly from the surface to 7999-foot MSL. What that tells you as a pilot is if you wanted to fly in the Pierce Ferry sector, you must fly at 8,000 feet MSL and above. And not only that, there is a frequency for you to monitor. To fly in that Pierce Ferry sector, you must monitor frequency 121.95. Just to the right is yet another sector. This sector is the Diamond Creek sector. Here you can't fly from the surface to 8999 MSL. To fly in the Diamond Creek sector, you must be 9,000 feet MSL and above. And in the Diamond Creek sector, the frequency for you to monitor is frequency 127.05. As we look at this chart, you'll see there are several sectors and frequencies for each sector. In addition, there are these purple areas. These purple areas are called flight-free zones. Now, these flight-free zones tell you that below 14,500 feet MSL, flight is prohibited. You must be 14,500 feet MSL and above to fly in these flight-free zones. Now, in between the flight-free zones are corridors, and this box tells you the altitude you have to fly in those corridors. If you're going to fly northbound in this particular corridor, you must be 11,500 feet or 13,500 feet MSL. Southbound, you'd be 10,500 feet MSL or 12,500 feet MSL. And there are several corridors, and each corridor has its own altitude. So to fly inside the Grand Canyon Special Flight Rules area, you have to follow these rules, you have to stay out of the flight-free zones, fly the proper altitude in the corridors, and fly the proper altitude and monitor the frequencies in the sectors. Now, that's the top side of this chart. Let's turn it over and take a look at the other side. The thing you'll notice when you get over here on this side of the chart is that there are various routes shown here. Well, the important thing to know about these routes is you cannot fly these routes unless you're a commercial air tour operator. Let's take a look at it. If you look very carefully inside this box, it says the routes and altitudes shown on this side of the Grand Canyon VFR aeronautical chart are to be used only by commercial air tour operators with specific authorization of the FAA Flight Standards District Office. So the important thing to know is even though you see routes over here on this side of the chart, you cannot fly these routes. These are for air tour operators only with approval of the FAA. The big lesson to learn about this chart is that if you intend to fly VFR in the Grand Canyon area, you'd better take a good look at this chart and study it in advance.
Well, John, after all that, the airspace system seems pretty complicated, doesn't it?
You bet it does, Martha. And it is. Many pilots say it's actually easier to fly IFR in congested airspace than it is to fly VFR. And you know what? I think that's true.
If you think about it, though, the reason the system is so complicated is to allow pilots to fly VFR. If you want to simplify things, all you have to do is make everything positive control airspace and make everybody fly IFR and just follow directions all the time.
Well, okay, I prefer complicated. But the complexity of the airspace does require a lot of planning, especially if you're going to fly VFR in congested airspace.
That's right, John. But just because you're instrument rated doesn't mean you can't get yourself into trouble, too. A few years back, when the New York airspace was still called a TCA instead of Class B airspace, John and I were flying into Teterboro Airport IFR from the southwest. And what happened to us when we came up on New York approach control, what they said was, expect a 45-minute hold at a VORTAC way down here to the southwest outside the New York area. The problem was not IFR weather. It was VFR weather. The problem is it was rush hour. And a 45-minute hold when the weather's VFR sure feels like a long time. So what did we do? We canceled IFR, just like that, right on the spot. Now, the problem with that, as you can probably guess, is that an airplane doesn't stand still. And we had not planned this out in advance. I was flying while John was frantically trying to get fixes set in the radios to avoid the New York Class B airspace. He was busier than a one-armed paper hanger because we hadn't planned it and hadn't prepared properly in advance. Single pilot operation, it would be almost impossible. And if the weather was marginal, that would just complicate it. So you need to plan for contingencies when you're flying in busy airspace like Class B airspace, contingencies like weather, and contingencies like traffic. Who else is going to be around and under that Class B airspace with you? It's crowded just outside of and under Class B airspace because everybody else is trying to avoid it also. So let's talk about how you can plan your strategy to fly VFR in complicated airspace legally and safely. Suppose you want to make a flight through the Los Angeles basin. You're starting out at Torrance Airport, which is in the southwest part of the LA basin, and you want to go all the way up to the northeast, up to the mountains to Big Bear Airport. Get some mountain recreation in. This is going to take a lot of planning, particularly if you have bad visibility, as the Los Angeles basin often does, or if you have marginal weather. You need to figure out ahead of time on the ground a strategy, either to deal with this complicated airspace flying in it, or to deal with it by avoiding it. In any case, you need to do your planning on the ground. And one of the first things you need to do is list the resources that you have to work with your particular aircraft and the airspace you're going to be flying in. First of all, what kind of electronic navigation is available? In terms of the aircraft equipment, VOR, DME, ADF, LORAN, GPS, what do you have, and what aids are available in that airspace that you're going to be able to tune to? And secondly, pilotage. What do you have on your planned route or possible route in the way of roads, railroads, power lines, and other major landmarks that will help you know exactly where you're located? And you want to use both methods of navigation, both electronic and pilotage, to help make sure that you know where you are and that you avoid airspace that you don't intend to be in. So let's start down at Torrance in the southwest part of the LA basin. Now, where we want to go from Torrance is out to the northeast to Big Bear, but that's not necessarily the way to start out. What you might want to do instead is head out to the southeast, because there's a lot of Class B airspace in the LA area located to the northeast of Torrance. Now, Torrance itself is located under the Class B LA airspace. The airspace there has a floor of 5,000 feet. What you might do is depart Torrance and pick up this airway going out to the southeast, which is the 123 radial off of Los Angeles. What that airway does is establish where your aircraft is located and make sure that you have position awareness. As you get down to the coastline, there are some landmarks you can pick up. For instance, the Queen Mary. It is a big ship, and it really stands out well. And so you can head towards that along the coastline. Now, just before you get to the Queen Mary, you're going to get to the edge of the Class D airspace around the Long Beach Airport. Unless you're going to talk to them, you need to go over that Class D airspace, and the ceiling on that is 2,600 feet MSL. Now, right in this area of Long Beach, you do not have to worry about the Los Angeles Class B airspace, because it's in kind of a slot there as far as the Class B airspace is concerned. But you do want to make sure you're high enough to stay out of the Long Beach Class D airspace unless you call them and get permission to go through. As you go through this airspace area, the next place you're going to get to is some more Class D airspace for Los Alamitos. Now, the ceiling on this one, the top of it, is 2,500 feet MSL. But Los Alamitos does have LA Class B airspace above it. The top of the Class B airspace is 12,500 feet, which is why we're not talking about going over the top of it. And the floor of the Class B airspace in this area is 6,000 feet. So you've got kind of a layer or slice. The top of the D airspace over Los Alamitos is 2,500 feet, but the floor of the LA Class B airspace is 6,000, and you've got that chunk of airspace in there, those altitudes that you can fly without having to communicate and get clearance from anyone. When you're going through an area like that, what you want to do is be careful not to get too close to the floor of the Class B airspace, the 6,000 feet MSL, because airliners and other Class B traffic could be exactly at that 6,000-foot floor in the Class B airspace. And remember, your altimeter probably has some error in it, so give yourself some space under that floor. 500 feet anyway would be a minimum amount of safe space to give you under that. Now, as you continue on towards the east, one of the things you have to watch out for is the Orange County area. Santa Ana has Class C airspace, and the Class C airspace over here has a top of 4,400 feet MSL and a floor of 2,000. Well, you're going to be higher than the 2,000 because you're clearing Long Beach and Los Alamitos and so on, and therefore you've got to make sure that you're above the 4,400 feet in order to be above the top of this Class C airspace for Santa Ana. So what you're doing is kind of threading your way through, making sure that you are high enough to miss the Class D airspace and hear the Class C airspace, but low enough to stay safely below the floor of the Los Angeles Class B airspace. Kind of threading your way through on those altitudes. Now, suppose that instead of going out this way and then heading on up to Big Bear, suppose that you had wanted to go more northeast bound to begin with. You've got a potential problem there. Because if you take a look at the airspace to the northeast of Torrance, you find a maximum elevation figure in this quadrant here of 1,700 feet. That is the highest figure of terrain and obstructions in that area. But notice that the floor of the Class B airspace in that area, down here it's 2,500 feet, over here it's 2,000 feet. So the floor of Class B airspace here is 2,000 feet, but your maximum elevation figure for terrain and obstructions is 1,700 feet. That is not much room for safe passage of your aircraft. One of the things you want to think about very carefully if you're going to go under Class B or Class C airspace is, are you going to have enough terrain clearance to be safe? So when you're planning a flight to avoid Class B airspace, close to Class B airspace, there's some things you want to watch out for. First of all, you want to watch out for other aircraft. Class B airspace is Class B because it's very busy with a lot of airline traffic and a lot of other traffic. Watch out for other aircraft. And there's going to be a lot of people with you trying to avoid flying in the Class B that are skirting around the edges and underneath it. Legally, but still a lot of traffic jammed up there. You want to try and allow yourself at least a 500-foot margin under the floor of that Class B airspace to allow for traffic that will be right at the floor altitude, and make sure that if either or both of you have some altimeter error, you're not going to meet each other unexpectedly. And you want to make sure that you plan your route very carefully in advance using both pilotage and electronic navigation to make sure you're going to be able to tell where your aircraft is all the time, and that you do not get into airspace that you do not have a clearance to go into, that you do not intend to go into. So when we went from Torrance up to Big Bear, the route that we followed was heading southeast instead of northeast, easier to avoid the Class B airspace, down to the coastline, over to the Queen Mary, out to the east-northeast, above Long Beach and Los Alamitos, and continuing to climb to be above Class C airspace for Santa Ana, and then on out to Big Bear. If you're going to fly pretty much straight northeast from there over towards Pomona, you're going to have to be very careful to watch for the floor of the Class B airspace and the terrain and obstructions to make sure that you have enough space there. Now suppose that you want to go through the Class B airspace instead of trying to avoid it. One of the things to be aware of is the visual checkpoints that are going to be marked on the charts. Visual checkpoints are the flags that you see on the charts, like this red flag that's sticking out of the Griffith Park Observatory here. Visual checkpoints are a convenient place for you to be when you call the controller. You can recognize when you're there, use the name to tell the controller where you are, and the controller knows exactly where you're located. That's what those flags stand for. It does not stand, like it might look like, for a golf course. The flags in this case are red, but they could also be blue or black. Anytime you see a visual checkpoint flag like that, it is fair game for you to call the controller up and use that as identification of where you're located. The controller is supposed to know about all of those. On the other hand, it's also fair game for the controller to call you up and ask you to report over any one of those visual checkpoints that's appropriate. And you're supposed to be able to find them on the chart. And if you look a little bit to the west of the Griffith Park Observatory, you'll see the visual checkpoint flag for the Hollywood Bowl. And to the west of there, we've got one for the Hollywood Hills and another one for the Sepulveda Pass. Ways to locate your position used by both pilots and controllers. Now, if you fly a helicopter in congested airspace, you know that it can be tough to watch out for traffic and also read a lot of detail on a chart. So many large metropolitan areas have special charts called helicopter route charts. And what those helicopter route charts do is give you specific routings, frequencies, reporting points, and holding points, but in a much clearer and quicker and easier to read way for people that are flying helicopters. Now, the routes are named. If you take a look at the routes on one of these, you'll find they actually have names. For instance, the Staten Island route. So all you have to do is tell the controller that I want the Staten Island route, and the controller knows exactly what routing you want to follow, and it's marked real heavy there on the chart, makes it easy for you to comply. If you have LORAN or GPS in your aircraft, you're both very favored and subject to a potential problem. Pilots with the most capable navigation equipment, like LORAN and GPS, are the ones who are most likely to blunder into special use airspace or into controlled airspace without a clearance. A full half of all the airspace violations are made by pilots who are navigating with LORAN or GPS. Why is that? Well, there's some problems, some potential problems with using LORAN and GPS. Number one would be old databases. Are the databases up to date with all the airspace changes and the airport changes? Number two, not knowing where the airspace is located, because most of them do not have any kind of moving map associated with them. And number three, not keeping track of the aircraft position in regard to airspace. Very easy, and a lot of pilots just simply tune in direct to some location and go charging across the country, and if you don't have a visual chart with you, you may go charging through all kinds of controlled airspace, special use airspace, and never even know you did it until you get that knock on the door. You know, it would be very nice to know ahead of time where glider operations and other special types of operations are taking place, so you can keep your eyes peeled, maybe even avoid them, and make sure you don't have some kind of close encounter. So, of course, they mark those for you on the chart. A glider operating area is shown by, of all things, a picture of a glider on the chart. If you have a parachute jump area, a designated parachute jump area, you'll see a parachute on the chart. Hang gliding is shown by a hang glider symbol, and if there's ultralight activity, you'll see an ultralight symbol on the chart. Now, these symbols tell you that that particular type of activity is taking place in that area, but it doesn't give you any detail. So where do you go for the detail on those operations? You take a look in the airport facility directory to get the detail. For instance, suppose that you're looking at Hemet Airport. And when you look at Hemet Airport, you notice they do have 2 runways, and they've got a glider symbol by the airport telling you that they've got some kind of glider operations going on. For the detail on that, you go to your airport facility directory, and when you look Hemet up in the airport facility directory, it says gliders will be operating north of the Hemet Airport, and runway 422 is restricted for glider operations. Now, for some of these operations, you have to have air traffic control authorization or approval before you do them, in particular types of airspace. For instance, if you're going to do parachuting, you have to have prior ATC authorization if you're going to do parachuting in Class A, B, C, or D airspace. Class D airspace is what we have around the Santa Maria Airport, and if you want to do parachuting in any of those airspaces, A, B, C, or D, you need prior approval from air traffic control. Now, if you want to do ultralight operations, you need a little bit more extensive approval in more airspace. For ultralight operations, prior ATC authorization is required not only in Class A, B, B, C, and D airspace, but also in the surface area, Class E airspace, which is what we have around the Paso Robles Airport. If you want to do ultralight activity in either Class A, B, C, D, or surface area E airspace, you've got to get air traffic control approval before the operations.
Well, Martha, one thing seems obvious after going through this. It's more important now than ever before to make sure that you have current charts with you.
That's right, John. And sometimes old-timers will think, why do I need new charts? After all, they say, the mountains don't move.
Maybe mountains don't change, but airspace does, and changes are taking place pretty fast these days.
They sure are. Well, that wraps up the complete airspace review. We hope you've enjoyed taking this course as much as we enjoyed putting it together for you. And remember, airplanes don't cause accidents, pilots do, and some of the smartest people can do some of the dumbest things.
You know, everybody's a damn fool for 15 minutes a day.
And some of us get even longer than that.
No problem. You know, I'm a superior pilot.
Yeah, sure you are.
No, really, it's true. You see, a superior pilot is one who uses his superior judgment to stay out of situations that might require his superior skill. Folks, have fun in your flying, and by all means, please,
Stay out of the trees.